My name is Gorath Vun. I am a senior intelligence analyst with the Vearan Dominion, specifically assigned to the 3rd Aerial Warfare Division. I have been at this for long enough to see things that would make most beings tremble, entire civilizations crumbling in the wake of battle, sieges that turn cities to dust, enemies so violent that even the most hardened warlords would take a pause. I have watched footage of entire species wiped out in mere hours, witnessed atrocities that would leave most of my colleagues reaching for their medical leave. I have seen it all. I am not a coward. But what happened above the human colony of Vascan Prime, what I experienced there, was something I have not been able to shake. Even after 14 standard cycles, after all the reports and analyses, I still don't have the right word to describe it. I've spent hours scouring the 47 languages I speak, looking for a term that could capture the essence of that moment, but I have yet to find one. Not even close. So, before I take you into the heart of that battle, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you isn't just another mission report. It's not about numbers or strategy. It's about something else entirely, something that shook the very foundations of my understanding. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. Or rather, let me start where I was sitting when everything began to go wrong. The command deck of the Valkyrian assault carrier Endless Sky smells like it always does. Recycled atmosphere mixed with a faint scent of anxiety from 700 soldiers who have been awake for far too long. I was stationed at the intelligence station, a rather fancy title for someone who spends their days crammed into a chair surrounded by more data screens than any reasonable being should ever have to deal with. The drink in my hand, a concoction labeled as stimulant beverage, tasted primarily like disappointment, but I swallowed it anyway. We had been hovering above the Vascan system for what felt like an eternity, though it had only been 9 hours. 9 hours of tedious pre-strike positioning, formation checks, weapons calibration, and the particular kind of boredom only experienced before a major military operation, the kind of boredom that makes you wish for something, anything, to happen just so you can move on. Our mission was clear. According to the Dominion's expansion directive, the Vascan system, particularly its 3rd planet, Vascan Prime, was to be incorporated into Dominion territory. The humans had established a colony there roughly 230 of their years ago, building cities, planting crops, naming streets after people long forgotten. By the end of the cycle, all of it was to become Dominion property. I had reviewed every piece of intelligence on this planet. There was nothing that suggested it would be any different from the countless other engagements we had already executed. The humans, after all, had no advanced military technology to speak of, and their fleet consisted of 62 atmospheric combat aircraft, mostly single-pilot craft with conventional guidance systems. In terms of firepower, it didn't even come close to the 400-strong wing we had at our disposal, let alone the 4 mighty carriers we had positioned in the system. On paper, it was simple. The mission was routine. Everyone on the Endless Sky was calm, ready to execute. But as the hours ticked by and we neared our target, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was wrong. The numbers were too comfortable. The human defenses seemed almost predictable. Commander Prex Dullen, who ran the Endless Sky with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never lost a campaign, strolled past my station. He paused for a moment, glancing over my screens. "Gorath," he said in that tone he used when he wanted to sound casual but was, in fact, giving an order. "Tell me about their air assets again." I cleared my throat, a gesture I had made countless times during briefings. The human colony of Vascan Prime operates a total of 62 atmospheric combat aircraft, designated locally as the VSSK Defense Wing. Their aircraft are single-pilot craft propulsion class 4 with conventional guidance systems, and their weapons loadout, I'll be honest, is somewhat concerning. Prex raised an arm in a gesture that meant, "Proceed." I continued. "Concerning in the way that their missiles appear to have targeting systems that should not be possible, given the manufacturing infrastructure available on this colony. Concerning in the way that 3 of their pilots hold personal kill records that would be impressive even by Dominion Special Forces standards. And concerning in the way that their entire tactical doctrine seems to have been written by someone who genuinely enjoys being in serious danger and wants to make sure everyone else is, too." There was a brief pause. "So, the concerning part is more of a footnote," Prex said, nodding in a way commanders do when they decide not to think too much about something. "Absolutely," I said, a little too quickly. Purely a footnote. I was lying. Not about the numbers. The numbers were accurate. But the numbers, when it came to humans, have a way of being deeply misleading. And that was the first mistake. That was when I realized, too late, that this mission would not be like any other we had faced before. The stage was set. The fleet was ready, confident. The mission was routine. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't quite place, but knew deep down would unravel everything. And that was just the beginning. By the time we entered the Vascan system, the endless sky had already completed the initial positioning and formation checks. Our fleet was spread out like a vast metallic spider, hovering just outside the upper atmosphere of Vascan Prime, poised to strike. The tension was almost palpable, though you could sense that most of the crew still held on to the comfort of certainty. The mission had been mapped out meticulously, and the numbers were in our favor. The command deck was quiet, as if every soldier aboard had entered a state of focus, preparing for what was to come. The enemy, the humans of Vascan Prime, had been under our surveillance for weeks. We knew everything about them. Their cities, their infrastructure, their military assets, all meticulously documented. The planet itself was not much of a prize, at least in terms of resources. But in the Dominion's view, it had to be claimed. It was a logical step in the expansion directive, part of the grand plan to extend our reach. The humans, after all, had lived there for over 2 centuries. Their technology, though quaint by Dominion standards, was functional. And the population had little to no defense against our superior force. Their fleet of 62 aircraft was little more than a footnote, a minor inconvenience in our plans. In comparison to our fleet of 400, with 4 massive carriers capable of devastating orbital strikes, their 62 pilots didn't seem like much. They were no match for the firepower at our disposal. As I stared out from my station at the tactical display, I thought back to the last time I'd been involved in something so straightforward. Every mission had its risks, its surprises, but we had been executing this exact type of operation for years. The human resistance on Vascan Prime wouldn't last long. I told myself that we would land, seize the cities, and incorporate the planet into the Dominion fold. Simple. Routine. Gorath. Prex Dullen's voice interrupted my thoughts. Are we ready? I glanced up. Prex stood at the central podium, his posture relaxed, arms behind his back. There was a quiet confidence about him, the kind of calm that comes from never having lost a campaign. He exuded the air of someone who was sure of his success, who had already planned for every contingency. His gaze swept over the tactical displays, taking in the data with the precision of a man who had overseen dozens of successful operations. Yes, Commander, I replied. Everything's in position. We're waiting for your orders. Prex nodded and turned his attention to the bridge crew. Initiate the first phase. Proceed as planned. The endless sky shifted slightly in its position, the subtle hum of the carrier's engines reverberating through the deck. All around me, officers went about their duties with the practiced ease of soldiers who had done this 1,000 times before. The operation was moving forward without a hitch. The calm before the storm. I turned my attention back to the tactical display. The Vascan Prime system was laid out before me like an unbroken canvas, our fleet descending into position, ready to sweep across the skies. We were set to unleash the first wave of our assault. The humans, I assumed, were preparing their defenses. Or perhaps they were already in disarray, uncertain and fearful. But then, something on the radar caught my eye. A tight beam transmission, encrypted with a cipher I immediately recognized as archaic, outdated even by our standards. I froze for a moment, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I processed the signal. The analysis system flagged it almost as an afterthought, so old, we stopped worrying about it centuries ago. I glanced at Tick, my young analyst, who was stationed beside me. She was a sharp one, capable of processing data at speeds that left most of us behind. Her hands flew across the console, accessing data, cross-referencing, decrypting. She looked up from her screen with a confused expression. Gorath, she said, this cipher, it's from their early military years. This shouldn't be in use. No one's used this in decades. Keep going, I instructed, watching her work. Get it decrypted. Let's see what they're hiding. The transmission, despite its archaic encryption, was coming from the Human Defense Network. My mind began to race. It was one of those moments when everything in your professional life tells you that something is off. The humans shouldn't be this organized. They shouldn't have advanced encryption systems like this, not without us knowing. They shouldn't have anything that could challenge us. And yet, here we were, facing a challenge I hadn't expected. Tick continued to decode the signal, her screen flickering as she worked. Then, a flash of information caught her attention. "It's done," she said, her voice strained. "Gorath, they're moving. All 62 aircraft are airborne." I felt a sudden coldness wash over me. Every piece of intelligence we had gathered, every bit of data from our surveillance, had painted a different picture. The human forces were supposed to be weak, fragmented, unprepared. But here they were, scrambling to mobilize their entire fleet, 62 aircraft, all of them launched, all of them ready to engage. There was a pause, a pregnant silence on the bridge. Prex, still standing at the podium, turned his head slowly. His gaze met mine. "All of them?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yes," I confirmed. "All of them. No reserves." "Why?" he asked, more to himself than to me. I didn't have an answer. And that was when the first seeds of doubt were planted in my mind. We had been anticipating an easy victory. We had been lulled by the sheer numbers, by the certainty of our tactical superiority. But now, the equation was changing. The humans weren't behaving as expected. They weren't retreating, they weren't panicking. They were acting. "Commander," I said, breaking the silence. "Something's not right. They shouldn't be doing this." Prex looked at me, his face unreadable. "Then we'll deal with it. Proceed with the operation as planned." But in that moment, I realized that this wasn't going to be like any other mission. The humans weren't just defending their territory. They were defending something far more important. As the fleet moved into position and the final preparations were made for the first strike, a sense of inevitability seemed to hang in the air. The command deck hummed with activity as officers finalized the logistical details, all confident that this engagement would be just another routine operation in the Dominion's endless expansion. But deep down, a cold, nagging feeling lingered in the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite shake, despite every piece of intelligence we had gathered pointing toward an easy victory. "Gorath," Prex Dullen's voice broke through my thoughts again. "I need a full status update." I turned back to my screen, pulling up the latest data. The human fleet had been in the air for just over 10 minutes, and yet there were no signs of fear or hesitation on their end. They weren't scattered or retreating to defensive positions as expected. No, they were holding formation, all 62 aircraft flying in unison, moving with purpose. I checked the radar again, but the readings didn't make sense. "Commander," I said, my voice growing strained, "they're not following any recognizable formation. They're flying in two distinct groups." Prex raised an eyebrow. "Two groups? Are they coordinated?" "They're incredibly coordinated," I replied. "One group consists of 58 aircraft, flying directly toward us. The other, 4 aircraft, far off to the side. They're barely within our sensor range, but their movements, I've never seen anything like it." "4," Prex repeated, clearly intrigued. "That's an odd number." "It is," I said, "especially considering how tightly coordinated the rest of their forces are." There was a brief silence as the magnitude of the situation began to sink in. 4 aircraft, seemingly insignificant compared to the overwhelming force we had brought to bear, should not have warranted this much attention. Yet, the way they were positioned and moving felt intentional. They were outliers, yes, but they were being tracked for a reason. Prex took a step closer to my station. "What are they doing?" I stared at the tactical display, watching as the 4 aircraft stayed far out on the periphery of the formation. "They didn't engage. They didn't attack. They didn't even approach. They simply watched." "They're not flying toward us," I said, still watching the readouts. "They're flying parallel. At an angle. Slowly climbing higher and higher." Prex was silent for a moment, considering the data. "Keep tracking them. I don't like the look of this." As the engagement began in earnest, the sheer audacity of the human pilots became apparent. The first 58 aircraft, the bulk of their force, began flying straight at us, head-on. The reaction from the endless sky was immediate. Our fleet's fighters, nearly 4 times their number, began descending, forming into the Dullen Formation, a precise, layered spread designed to cover the colony's 3 primary cities. It was foolproof. It had worked countless times before in over 900 recorded engagements. It was the textbook method for dominating an airspace, the best strategy we had perfected over centuries. And yet, the humans didn't flinch. Instead of dispersing, as expected, the 58 aircraft flew directly into the heart of our formation, at maximum speed, firing continuously. This was madness. Suicide, in every tactical manual. They were charging into the densest part of our formation, where our firepower was most concentrated. I leaned forward in my chair, heart pounding. "Tick, I need a damage assessment now. What's happening to our fighters?" Tick's fingers flew across her console. "We've lost 32 aircraft in the first 40 seconds, Gorath," she said, her voice calm, despite the chaos unfolding on the screen. "But the remaining 26 are still inside our formation. They've managed to weave through the gaps." "Impossible," I muttered. "How are they doing this?" "They were threading between our aircraft. It was as if our formation wasn't even there. The numbers were supposed to make us invincible, 400 of the finest Dominion fighters, against 62 disorganized human aircraft. And yet, somehow, 26 human fighters had embedded themselves in the heart of our formation, flying between our ships, around our ships, and beneath our ships, all while still firing relentlessly. The tactical display updated in real time, the numbers shifting constantly. We were under attack from within. These 26 human aircraft weren't just fighters anymore. They had turned the battlefield into a chaotic web, a trap we couldn't escape. Prex's voice broke through the noise on the command deck. "Gorath, what's happening? What's their tactic?" I clenched my jaw. "They're using our own formation against us, Commander. The humans are forcing our aircraft into close proximity, making it impossible for us to fire without hitting our own ships." Prex turned to me with a hard expression, his eyes narrowing. "And those 4 outliers? What's their purpose?" "Right now, they're just watching," I said. "But I don't believe it's random. There's a purpose behind this." As the battle raged on, I found myself fixating on those 4 outliers, the small group that had stayed away from the main fray. The first wave of 58 human aircraft, though half destroyed, had already succeeded in destabilizing our formation. It was like the human pilots had planned for us to be distracted. They had pulled us in, squeezed us together, and made us more vulnerable. Then, just when I thought we might have the upper hand, it happened. One of the 4 outlier aircraft, designated Iron Lance 1, began climbing at an impossible angle. Dex Varro, the pilot of this craft, had already proven to be dangerously creative in his previous engagements. I checked his record, 44 confirmed kills over 9 years of active service. But that wasn't what worried me. It was the fact that he was still alive. As the Iron Lance 1 began its climb, the rest of the 4 aircraft followed in unison. They banked together, aligning themselves in a formation I couldn't understand. They weren't attacking. They weren't making any direct moves. But their presence alone began to unsettle me. It was as if they were preparing for something much bigger. "We need to understand those 4, I said to Prex, my voice urgent. "They're the key. They're not part of the initial assault, but they are going to make their move soon." The humans were still using the terrain, still threading through our defenses in ways that we hadn't anticipated. And with every passing moment, the realization began to dawn on me. This wasn't just a routine operation anymore. The humans weren't just fighting us to defend a colony. They were fighting us because they had a purpose. They weren't here to die. They were here to make us pay for underestimating them. And as I watched Iron Lance 1 continue its climb, I knew this battle was far from over. The endless sky shuddered slightly as it moved through the atmospheric layers, descending further toward Vascan Prime. It had been 30 minutes since the engagement began, and the battlefield was a chaotic swirl of aircraft. Our initial plan, a methodical sweep and destruction of the human forces, was already falling apart. The human pilots had proven far more resourceful than we had given them credit for. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were actively reshaping the battlefield, forcing us into positions we hadn't planned for. And the 4 outliers? The ones that had stayed on the fringes of our formation? They were still there, still waiting. Their movements, calculated, deliberate, were becoming harder to ignore. My gut told me that they were waiting for the right moment to strike, but I couldn't figure out how. What was their plan? Prex stood at the central podium, hands clasped behind his back, observing the unfolding chaos. He had the expression of a man who was beginning to realize that things weren't going according to the carefully laid plans. His eyes flickered from one screen to another, taking in the data. "Gorath," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of unease. "What's their next move?" I glanced at the tactical display. The 4 outliers had been circling the outskirts of our fleet for nearly an hour, barely engaging with any of our forces, but still maintaining tight coordination among themselves. The rest of the human forces, the 58 aircraft, had already infiltrated our formation, taking advantage of the chaos to fire freely, threading between our fighters, making it impossible for us to retaliate without risking friendly fire. But these 4, they weren't part of the first wave. They hadn't charged into the heart of the battle. They were waiting, hovering at the edges, like predators watching their prey. "I'm not sure," I said, my mind racing. "But whatever it is, they're waiting for us to make a move. These 4 are too organized, too precise to be random. I think they've been waiting for us to lose our position." I looked over at Tick, my young analyst, who was staring at her screen with wide eyes. She had been working non-stop, tracking the human aircraft with almost no breaks, her face pale from the mental strain. "Gorath," she said, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "The 4 outliers. They're not just waiting. They're isolating us." I furrowed my brow, unsure of what she meant. "Isolating us?" "Yes," she said, quickly pulling up a new set of data. "They've been subtly maneuvering in such a way that they're pushing our fighters into tighter formations. It's like they're trying to make our already weakened formation even smaller, compressing it." I stared at the display. It was true. The once loose formation we had maintained was now becoming denser. Our fighters, which should have been scattered across a broad grid, were being pushed together into a smaller, more concentrated space. And the more they tightened their formation, the more vulnerable they became to concentrated fire. Prex didn't say anything, but his sharp eyes betrayed his growing understanding of what was happening. "Are we being herded?" "That's exactly what's happening," I replied. "The human pilots are intentionally creating chaos within our ranks, not by attacking us head-on, but by disrupting our formation. They're forcing us to cluster together. And the more we bunch up, the easier it is for them to pick us off." Prex turned toward the tactical display, his gaze narrowing as he saw the same thing I did. Our fighters were now so closely packed that even the most basic defensive tactics, things like intercepting enemy aircraft before they entered range, were becoming less effective. The humans, with their erratic and unpredictable flying patterns, had essentially taken control of the airspace without firing a single shot at our fleet directly. And then it happened. In the midst of all this, the 4 outliers, Iron Lance 1, the leader, and the rest of the group, began to move, their formation tightening in unison. They began to climb, each aircraft moving up into the upper atmosphere, drawing closer to the heart of our fleet. "They're coming for us," I said, my voice urgent. "They've been playing us this whole time. While we've been distracted by the 58 aircraft, they've been setting the stage for a more devastating move." I could hear Prex's teeth clench as he processed the information. "What do you recommend?" "We need to break formation immediately," I said, my mind racing. "If we don't, they'll box us in completely." The longer we stay in this tight cluster, the easier it will be for them to pick us off one by one. We need to disperse now. Prex hesitated, his mind working through the implications of what I was saying. Breaking formation during an engagement was risky. It could cause confusion, disrupt communication, and leave us exposed. But the alternative, staying packed into our current formation, was worse. Much worse. Gorath, Prex said finally, his voice heavy. Break the formation. Full disperse. Maximum separation. Now. The order was given, and across the fleet, pilots scrambled to react. It wasn't instant, though. A maneuver like this required time, precision, and coordination. As the endless sky issued the order, I watched the fleet's indicators on my screen. Hundreds of fighters, slowly breaking off from the cluster and reorienting into separate positions, moving away from the human forces. But time wasn't on our side. As we initiated the break, the 4 outliers, Iron Lance 1 and its wingmates, were already on the move. They had banked, climbed, and now began their descent back toward us, diving at an angle that left me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. They weren't just attacking. They were positioning themselves for something far more dangerous. At that moment, the realization hit me hard. We had been set up. Gorath, Prex's voice came through again, this time tight with urgency. What's going on with those 4? I couldn't look away from the screen. Iron Lance 1 was diving straight toward the heart of our fleet, while the others flanked it in perfect coordination. I watched in disbelief as they passed through the debris field of our earlier engagement, the wreckage of the 112 fighters we had already lost. The Vearans, trained to avoid such hazards, wouldn't have dared to enter the field. But these human pilots, they were flying right through it. They were coming directly for us. I looked back at Prex. They're doing it on purpose. They're forcing us into a vulnerable position. We need to move now, or they'll make us bleed. The situation had changed, and we were now fighting on their terms. The 4 outliers, led by Iron Lance 1, weren't just attacking. They were making us do the hard work for them, using our own formation to set the trap. By forcing us to break apart, they were setting the stage for an attack we hadn't anticipated. We had been herded, boxed in, and now we were facing the consequences of our overconfidence. As I watched the human pilots descend, as I saw them take their positions with a speed and precision that defied reason, I knew we were in deeper than we realized. We weren't facing an ordinary enemy. We were facing something different. And it was about to cost us dearly. The first blast hit us harder than anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't a missile strike, nor an orbital bombardment. It was something different, something that felt wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't register immediately, but sinks deep into your bones. The human pilots, it seemed, weren't interested in following the rules we expected them to play by. They weren't simply flying toward us to engage. They had lured us into this moment, into this trap. As I watched the human formation close in, my eyes fixed on Iron Lance 1. I had seen the evasive maneuvers they had been performing earlier, the impossible speeds, the audacity of flying through debris fields and fire columns. But now, everything clicked. The chaos was by design. This wasn't just about the human pilots surviving, it was about us making the fatal mistake. It was about misjudging what they were truly capable of. And then, with horrifying clarity, it happened. Iron Lance 1, the lead aircraft of the 4 outliers, suddenly veered upwards and then dropped. The move was so abrupt, it caught our sensors off guard. My screen blinked in confusion as the tracking lost the signal. The heat signatures vanished. Where did it go? I shouted, reaching for the sensors. Tick, still glued to her screen, barely looked up. It's still there, Gorath. But something's wrong. The tracking systems can't lock on. Before I could process what was happening, I saw it. The rest of the Iron Lance group was diving straight for us, not in a standard attack run, not in a way that we could easily calculate. They weren't aiming at individual aircraft, they were aiming at us as a collective force. And then, with a sickening feeling, I saw it. Iron Lance 4, the final aircraft, the one that had been bothering me from the start, had opened its payload doors. I froze. Thermobaric dispersal device. My mind screamed. A weapon of mass destruction. The tactical systems alert flashed across my screen. Thermobaric dispersal device, military grade, active. The system immediately began calculating the blast radius, the potential for destruction. The numbers updated rapidly, the system recalculating with each fraction of a second. The blast radius was far larger than any of us had anticipated. The device was designed for area denial, a powerful thermobaric weapon that could wipe out entire formations in a single burst. Prex stood next to me, his eyes wide with disbelief. Gorath, how long do we have? I didn't answer right away. My mind was too busy calculating the damage, too busy watching the formation break apart. 112 of our fighters had already been destroyed in the first wave. We couldn't afford another hit like this. But there was nothing we could do. The formation was already too tight, too vulnerable, too long, I finally said, my voice hollow. We had been wrong. We had underestimated the humans. Underestimated Dex Varro, the so-called dangerously creative pilot who had designed the entire engagement. He had planned this, every detail, knowing exactly how our fleet would respond. The thermobaric device was his final play, a weapon designed not just to destroy but to break us. I watched helplessly as the countdown ticked down on the tactical display. The blast radius was calculated, and it was expanding faster than we could react. And then, it happened. The device went off, and the world around me seemed to shudder. The blast was cataclysmic. The shock wave ripped through the formation, sending waves of destruction across our fleet. I could see the figures on the tactical display blink out one by one, each aircraft marked for destruction. The screen flashed red as our systems struggled to process the data. 112 down in 9 seconds, Tick reported, her voice calm but strained. We've lost half of our wing fighters. Damage assessments coming in. I couldn't focus on the numbers. The loss was too great, too immediate. Our entire front line had been obliterated in seconds, leaving a hole in our formation so wide, so gaping, that I wasn't sure we could recover. Prex looked at me, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. His expression had changed, no longer confident, no longer certain. He had seen defeat before, but not like this. What now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Scatter, I said, my voice hoarse. We need to break formation. Now. But it was too late. As the thermobaric device detonated and we scrambled to react, another horrifying realization set in. The Iron Lance 4, the aircraft I had been watching with growing concern, had not deployed its communication suppressor yet. It still had that weapon, that one piece that could ensure our total failure. We need to prioritize Iron Lance 4 immediately, I said, my thoughts racing. It's still carrying the suppressor. If it deploys, we'll lose all communication, all coordination. Prex nodded sharply, snapping to action. Get me targeting solutions on Iron Lance 4. Orv, our weapons officer, was already working on it. His fingers danced across the console, inputting data, calculating trajectories, trying to lock onto the elusive craft. But Iron Lance 4 was moving in ways we couldn't predict. Its maneuvers were not just evasive. They were designed to evade the very idea of being hit. We've lost tracking, Orv said quietly. It's in the debris field, and we can't lock on with the point defense systems. I could see it on the screen. Iron Lance 4 weaving through the wreckage of our own destroyed fighters, its evasive moves impossible to follow. It was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to deploy the communication suppressor. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw it. The aircraft performed a maneuver I couldn't believe. It dropped, spiraled, and then banked sideways, not up, not down, but sideways, through a column of superheated fire. The heat signatures from the debris field were so intense that it should have rendered the aircraft invisible to our sensors. But the Iron Lance 4 slipped through the fire as though it were an ordinary obstacle, as though it were just another part of the environment, effortlessly evading our tracking systems. By the gods, Orv whispered. How is it doing that? I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. I was watching it happen. Iron Lance 4 wasn't just evading our weapons. It was orchestrating the perfect trap, using the fire, the wreckage, the confusion, everything, to make us lose our ability to target it. And when it emerged from the fire, it was already too late. The suppressor deployed. Silence fell over the command deck. For a few agonizing seconds, no one spoke. Our fleet, our carefully orchestrated formation, was now blind. Our communication systems were down. We could no longer relay targeting data, no longer coordinate maneuvers. Every ship was on its own. And the humans, with their 41 remaining fighters, knew exactly where we were. "We've lost all communication," Tick said, her voice thick with disbelief. "The suppressor, it's working." I stared at the screen. The numbers were changing again. Our fighters were scattered, their targets unknown. We had no central command, no communication between ships. The human fighters, now free to move, began to converge on our carriers. "We need to withdraw," I said, finally breaking the silence. "Now. Full retreat." But even as I spoke, I knew. It was too late. The command deck of the Endless Sky was a maelstrom of chaos. The blast radius of the thermobaric device had left us crippled, but the deployment of the communication suppressor had sealed our fate. For the first time in my career, I was looking at a situation where the Dominion's vast, overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower was not enough to guarantee victory. Prex Dullan stood at the central podium, his face drawn tight, the color draining from his features. The usual confidence that had once been his trademark was now replaced by the cold reality of failure. He was a commander used to success, used to controlling every aspect of battle, but now he was powerless, just like the rest of us. "Gorath," Prex said, his voice low, "what do we do now?" I stared at the tactical display. Our remaining fleet was scattered, each ship and fighter isolated without coordination. There was no central command. No one to guide us through the chaos. The human fighters, now free to move without interference, were closing in. Their positioning was perfect. They had anticipated our every move, forced us into every mistake. "The only thing we can do," I said, my voice hoarse with exhaustion, "is retreat. We have no other option." Prex nodded, though there was a long, painful pause before he spoke again. "Get us out of here," he said simply, as if finally accepting the inevitability of the situation. "Full withdrawal. Now." The order was given, but the process of retreat was far from instantaneous. Our 4 carriers, massive and lumbering in comparison to the nimble human fighters, began to pull back slowly from the atmosphere. The process was painstaking. Every second felt like an eternity as the ships moved out of range of the battlefield, slowly ascending into the empty space above Vascan Prime. It wasn't just our fleet we had to worry about now, it was our lives. Our reputation. The Dominion had sent us to annex Vascan Prime, and now we were retreating. In defeat. The ramifications of this would echo through the highest levels of command. There was no coming back from this kind of failure. Not for a fleet like ours. "Orv," Prex said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Status report. How many of our aircraft are still operational?" Orv, our weapons officer, quickly brought up a new data set. His hands moved with practiced precision, though I could see the strain in his eyes. He didn't want to say it, but we both knew what the numbers would show. "We've lost 112 fighters," he said, his voice tight. "The rest of the fleet is still operational, but they're scattered. We've lost 40% of our wing strength already, and we're still being targeted by the humans." My eyes snapped to the screen. There they were, 41 human aircraft, still intact, moving with deadly precision. The survivors of the initial assault. But they weren't just surviving. They were moving in, closing the gap, aiming directly for our carriers. There was no doubt in my mind now. They weren't here to destroy us. They had already done that. Now, they were after something else. Prex must have realized the same thing, for he turned to me sharply. "What do they want?" "They want us to leave," I said quietly. "We're not worth the cost anymore. They've taken enough from us to make us reconsider. It's not about territory," It's about sending a message. Prex didn't respond. He simply stared at the screen, his mind clearly calculating the weight of the situation. For the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes, something I had never seen in him before. The withdrawal process continued, agonizingly slow. The communication suppressor had temporarily rendered us blind and deaf. But even now, with our fleet slowly pulling back, the remaining human aircraft had positioned themselves in such a way that we couldn't move freely. They were moving in, not with aggression, but with purpose. They weren't attacking in the way we had expected. No, they were directing us, forcing us to retreat at a pace that suited them, not us. I glanced at the communication systems. The systems were still down, but a low-frequency signal persisted, a civilian emergency band. The same frequency used for distress signals, weather updates, anything other than military communications. Why would the humans use this? It didn't make sense. Then it came. A voice. A simple message. This is VSSK Iron Lance 1. Message received. Good luck on your way home. I froze. It wasn't an ultimatum. It wasn't a taunt. It wasn't the arrogant words of a victorious enemy. It was almost casual, as if to say, "You've lost. And now you can leave. But we're still here. We're still alive. And we'll be watching." Tick, who had been silently monitoring the signal, spoke up softly. It's almost polite." I turned to her, my mind still processing the words. "They've won. But they don't need to rub our faces in it. They've made their point." I looked back at Prex, who had turned pale at the voice's message. He seemed to age a few years in that moment, the reality of what had happened sinking in. "They're not just fighting for survival," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're fighting because they have something worth protecting. It's not about numbers. It's about home. And we've just learned the hard way that humans defending their homes are a force we've never faced before." Prex nodded slowly, the realization settling on him. "We've underestimated them," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We thought this would be easy. Routine. But this wasn't a battle. This was something else." As our fleet finally broke free from Vascan Prime's atmosphere and jumped into the transit corridor, I glanced at the planet below. The blue-green orb shrank behind us, receding into the distance. Vascan Prime, once a strategic target, was now just a memory. A place we had tried, and failed, to conquer. I had spent years analyzing enemies, tactics, and strategies. I had seen entire civilizations brought to their knees. But this battle, this failure, would remain with me forever. The humans weren't just defending their land, they were defending their very existence. And that, I now knew, made them invincible. The void between star systems was quiet. Too quiet. The endless sky and the remaining Dominion fleet drifted in the dark, the hum of their engines the only sound that accompanied us. In that silence, the enormity of our defeat began to settle in. The Vascan system, a place we had once considered a mere stepping stone in our conquest, now felt like an indelible scar on the Dominion's reputation. We had been forced to withdraw. For the first time in my career, I had witnessed a fleet like ours, built for power and dominance, driven out by 62 human pilots. Not through sheer strength, not through overwhelming numbers, but through something else, something we had failed to understand until it was too late. I stood at my station, staring at the tactical readouts that flickered weakly on my screen. The human aircraft, their numbers now dwindled to 41, were still on our sensors, but they had stopped pursuing. They had made their point. They had beaten us. The message was clear: we are not welcome here. Prex Dullen had been silent for the entire journey back to Dominion space. He had stayed at the central podium, staring at the display without moving, as if hoping the retreating signals would somehow change, that we would find a way to turn the tide in our favor. But the signals didn't change. They didn't need to. The human pilots had already delivered their victory, a victory that would be spoken about for years to come. Finally, Prex spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "What will they say when we get back?" I turned to him, a feeling of dread settling in my chest. The Dominion High Command would not take this lightly. A report of such a loss would mean an inquiry, and an inquiry meant questions we couldn't easily answer. "They'll say we failed," I said, my voice heavy. "They'll look at the numbers, the 112 aircraft we lost in the first phase, the 112 we lost to their thermobaric device, and they'll want to find the error. They'll want to place blame." Prex nodded. "And they'll blame the execution." I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what he meant. It was always easier to blame the people on the front lines. The commanders. The analysts. The ones who were sent in to execute the plan. The truth of the matter was, the error wasn't in the execution. It was in the premise. The premise that 62 human aircraft, despite all the intelligence reports, despite everything we had learned about their capabilities, were an acceptable threat to a fleet of 400 ships. The premise that numbers, firepower, and sheer force could guarantee victory. The truth was, we had misunderstood the nature of the enemy we faced. The humans didn't just fight for survival. They fought because they had something worth defending: their homes, their families, their colonies. That was something we hadn't considered. Something that had never been accounted for in our tactical manuals. "We underestimated them," Prex said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "Yes," I replied. "We did." The hours stretched on as we made our way back to Dominion space. The silence on the bridge was unbearable, a constant reminder of the magnitude of what had happened. Every time I looked at the tactical display, the numbers seemed to burn themselves into my mind. 112 aircraft lost. 41 human aircraft still intact. And the message, transmitted on the civilian emergency band: "Good luck on your way home." It haunted me. I found myself thinking about the humans. About Dex Varro, the one who had orchestrated this entire engagement. I had studied his record before, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him. Something beyond the numbers, beyond the statistics. He wasn't just a good pilot. He was a symbol of everything we had underestimated. And I couldn't help but wonder what he saw when he looked at us. Was he afraid? Was he angry? Or was he simply doing what had to be done to protect the people and the place he called home? Tick, still at her station, spoke up quietly. "Gorath, I've been looking over the reports. The High Command will want us to prepare a detailed analysis. What should we tell them?" I thought about it for a long moment before responding. "Tell them the truth," I said. "That we underestimated them. That the humans defending their colony were unlike anything we've faced before. That they didn't just fight with technology or tactics. They fought with something deeper, something we couldn't have predicted." Tick nodded, typing furiously at her console as she processed the information. "It'll take time to compile," she said. "But I'll make sure it's detailed. The full engagement log, everything from the first strike to the communication intercept. They'll have all the data." "And the conclusion?" I asked, my voice tight. "The conclusion," Tick said softly, "will be the hardest part." As the endless sky neared Dominion space, I found myself reflecting on what had happened. The human pilots had fought like they had nothing to lose, like the battle was not just about survival, but about something far more important. They fought as if the world itself, their world, depended on it. The Dominion, on the other hand, had approached this operation like a simple military exercise. We had been certain of victory. We had looked at the numbers and believed they told the entire story. We had been wrong. I had seen battles before, seen entire civilizations crushed under the weight of the Dominion's might. But this was different. This wasn't a battle for territory or resources. It was a battle for the very idea of home. And we had lost. Prex looked at me one last time before the endless sky entered the docking bay. His eyes were weary, the weight of the failure resting heavily on his shoulders. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both knew what awaited us when we reported back. The inquiry. The questions. The scrutiny. And yet, despite the crushing sense of failure, despite the loss and the humiliation, I couldn't shake the respect I felt for the human pilots. They had shown me something I hadn't realized I needed to learn. The power of home. The power of defending what matters. As the ship docked and the crew prepared to disembark, I couldn't help but wonder about Dex Varro. About the 4 outliers. And about the lessons we had learned, too late. I would write the report, of course. I would detail everything. The engagements, the losses, the thermobaric device, the communication suppressor. But as I finished typing the final line, I couldn't help but add one last note. The error was not in the execution. The error was in the premise. The Dominion must reassess its understanding of human military psychology. And when we do, we will know that humans fighting to protect their homes are not just an acceptable threat. They are a force to be reckoned with. The days following our return to Dominion space were long, painful, and filled with a quiet, suffocating sense of failure. The endless sky docked in the military port, its once proud hull now marked by the scarring of battle. But it wasn't just the physical damage that weighed on me. It was the looming inevitability of what was to come, the meeting with Dominion High Command. In the vast, sterile corridors of the Dominion Central Command facility, the air was thick with anticipation. Officers and analysts moved briskly past us, their faces betraying the same anxiety that gripped my own chest. This was the fallout from the Vascan incident. This wasn't just a loss of aircraft. This was a loss of strategy, a loss of prestige, and, most damning of all, a loss of credibility for the Dominion. Prex Dullen walked beside me, his normally unflappable demeanor cracked under the weight of the last few days. As we approached the High Command's conference room, the quiet hum of the command facility became a distant murmur. It was the kind of silence that accompanies a death sentence. We were ushered into the chamber, where the Dominion's upper brass waited for us. The room was vast, its walls lined with holoscreens that displayed strategic maps, intel data, and the faces of the commanding officers. At the center of the room stood a large circular table, around which sat the most senior officers of the Dominion, including those responsible for intelligence, strategy, and military operations. Their faces were cold, impassive, but their eyes burned with an unspoken question. What went wrong? Prex stood first and saluted the council. I followed suit, but the motion felt automatic, lacking the usual confidence. The room was eerily still. There was no pleasantry, no formalities. Just the weight of our failure, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Gorath Vun, one of the senior officers, spoke first, their voice cutting through the silence. Senior Intelligence Analyst for the 3rd Aerial Warfare Division. Your report has been reviewed, and it paints a rather difficult picture. I nodded, standing firm despite the storm of emotions within me. Yes, sir. Explain, the officer continued, his gaze narrowing. Explain how 62 human aircraft managed to not only resist a superior force, but also make us retreat. What did we miss? I took a breath, knowing that my answer would set the tone for everything that followed. What we missed, sir, was the human spirit. The willingness to fight for something far beyond tactics and strategy, something intangible that we didn't understand. I could see a flicker of confusion in their eyes. They expected numbers. They expected cold, hard data. They didn't expect this. The humans defending Vascan Prime weren't fighting just for survival or territory, I continued. They were fighting for their homes, their families, the very essence of their existence. When we underestimate something as primal as that, it changes the nature of the conflict. Primal? The officer interrupted, incredulity creeping into his voice. You're telling us that we failed because we didn't anticipate their motivation? Is that what you're suggesting, Gorath? I hesitated, but I knew I had to push forward. Yes, sir. The Dominion's tactics have always been based on overwhelming firepower and superior numbers. But against the humans, those numbers were misleading. They fought as though losing wasn't an option. They understood something we didn't, that sometimes, a war isn't just about winning. It's about ensuring that what matters to you survives. And for the humans of Vascan Prime, that meant everything. The room fell into silence again, and I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. Prex stood quietly beside me, his gaze fixed ahead. I could tell he was already preparing for the reprimands, the consequences. But the truth was, Neither of us had the answers they were seeking. There was no neat solution to this failure. No excuse that would satisfy them. Another officer, one of the High Command's senior strategists, leaned forward. "You're suggesting, then, that this failure wasn't a matter of tactics or intelligence?" They paused, as if weighing the enormity of what they were about to say. "Are you implying we need to rethink our approach to human colonies?" "Yes, sir," I answered, my voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I recommend we do a full review of our tactical doctrines concerning human defenses. The Vascan engagement wasn't just a loss of aircraft. It was a failure of understanding. Human military capabilities, especially in defensive situations, are not something we can quantify the way we have with other species." Prex spoke up then, his voice quieter, but just as resolute. "The Dominion needs to reassess its strategic assumptions. If we continue underestimating the value humans place on defending their homes, we'll face more defeats like this." The silence stretched on. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the council began to murmur among themselves. I could feel the air shift in the room, and I knew that something had changed. Perhaps not immediately, but in time, the Dominion would start to understand what we had learned the hard way, that the human resolve, when defending their world, was something we couldn't easily break. Finally, the senior officer who had been questioning us spoke again, his voice much calmer. "Your report will be forwarded for a full review, Gorath. But we will not sugarcoat this. Your division is to be reassigned to a new operational task. This incident will not be forgotten, but neither will the lessons learned from it. Prepare yourself for that." The meeting ended in formalities. We stood and saluted, but the usual sense of camaraderie was absent. As we left the room, I couldn't help but feel that the repercussions of the Vascan incident would ripple through the Dominion for years to come. It wasn't just about the loss of 112 aircraft or the failure to conquer a planet. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The Dominion had always prided itself on its military might, but now it had been forced to confront a new reality. Humans, when backed into a corner, didn't just fight, they evolved. In the days that followed, I threw myself into reviewing the engagement, poring over every piece of data, every report, trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong. The numbers still didn't add up. How could 62 human pilots, outmatched by all reasonable measures, have orchestrated such a devastating defeat? Then it hit me, it wasn't just their military tactics. It wasn't even their pilots' incredible creativity. It was their refusal to back down. And that, above all else, was something we hadn't accounted for. Humans didn't just fight to win. They fought to survive. They fought because they had something worth dying for. As I continued to review the data, I realized just how much we had miscalculated. But in some way, that realization gave me a sense of clarity. The Dominion had always seen its strength in its numbers, its firepower, and its cold, calculated tactics. But it had overlooked one critical factor: human determination. The weeks following our return from Vascan Prime were marked by a quiet but palpable shift within the Dominion's ranks. The High Command had launched into a full-scale review of the Vascan incident, but they were struggling to digest the reality we had faced. For years, the Dominion had prided itself on the superiority of its fleet, its technological edge, and its ability to crush opposition with overwhelming force. But that comfort was gone now. The once untouchable tactical playbook was no longer enough. The report I had written was dissected in the highest echelons of command. They wanted answers. They wanted to know how we could have misjudged human military capabilities so severely. And they were starting to realize that this wasn't just a matter of losing a battle. This was a matter of understanding the human spirit. I was called to brief the top strategists and intelligence officers again. Prex Dullan, too, had been reassigned temporarily to oversee the restructuring of our military intelligence division. He had become an unwilling symbol of failure, but he held his composure with a professionalism that was hard to ignore. There were few commanders who could maintain dignity in the wake of such a catastrophic defeat, but Prex was one of them. The briefing room this time was much quieter, more solemn than before. The tables were surrounded by high-ranking officers, all with one singular question in their minds: how do we deal with humans now? As I began my presentation, the same uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The officers, usually sharp and quick with their remarks, seemed hesitant. There was a palpable reluctance to confront the truth of the situation, a truth I had only begun to understand in the wake of the battle. "We are dealing with an entirely different kind of enemy," I started, my voice steady but carrying a weight I hadn't felt before. "Humans are not like the other species we've encountered. They do not fight purely for conquest, resources, or expansion. When they fight for home. And that, above all else, makes them incredibly dangerous." There was a brief murmur from the officers around the table, and I saw their eyes narrow as they tried to process the implications of this statement. It was a harsh pill to swallow. The Dominion had always viewed its enemies through a lens of resources and tactical advantage. Humans, by contrast, were motivated by something intangible, something deeply personal. Their homeland, their history, their way of life. "They don't stop," I continued. "And that's the biggest mistake we made. Every report we've reviewed on human defensive engagements carries a common thread. They do not stop. When defending their homes, they adapt and change their tactics as the battle evolves. They think in a way that doesn't fit into our tactical manual." Another officer spoke, his voice skeptical. "But what does that mean for us? How do we face them if they're unpredictable?" "That's exactly it," I said, trying to keep my composure. "We cannot rely on our typical assumptions. We cannot predict their movements with the same calculations we've used against other species. What we saw on Vascan Prime was a creative, fluid battlefield. The humans don't approach war like other species. They operate with a different mindset, one that we can't just quantify with numbers." I could see the officers processing this. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth was difficult, but necessary. They had always been able to rely on numbers and statistics to dictate the outcome of a battle, but against humans, that was no longer enough. And if we were to succeed in future engagements, we needed to adapt, to evolve. The days after the debriefing were filled with long hours of analysis and discussion. The Dominion's elite strategists had already begun reviewing and updating our military doctrine. I was tasked with helping reshape the intelligence division's approach to human threats, but it was clear that the changes would need to be far-reaching. Our standard battle tactics were no longer enough. We had to prepare for unpredictability, for the human willingness to sacrifice and fight for things far beyond mere territory. One evening, Prex and I sat alone in the command center, reviewing the latest tactical proposals. He looked over at me, the weight of the last few weeks clearly bearing down on him. He had spent years as one of the most respected commanders in the Dominion, and now, he found himself at the center of a military shift. "You know, I still can't believe it," he said quietly, staring at the data streams. "We spent so much time preparing for this invasion, so much time focusing on their weaknesses. And we missed the one thing that could have changed everything." I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. The truth was too hard to articulate. But after a long pause, I finally spoke. "We underestimated them. But we can't afford to make that mistake again. The humans aren't our typical enemy. Their resolve, their adaptability, it's a different kind of warfare. One we haven't faced before." Prex exhaled deeply, his fingers tapping against the console. "And now we have to evolve, or we'll be left behind. They don't fight by our rules. They rewrite the rules as they go. And we need to learn how to fight their fight." I nodded. Yes. It's not just about firepower anymore. It's about the will to continue, even when all seems lost. And that's something we need to incorporate into our strategy moving forward. The Dominion High Command, after weeks of deliberation, finally released their revised strategy. It was comprehensive, a complete overhaul of our existing tactical manual. The new doctrine emphasized adaptability, creative warfare, and the importance of understanding human resilience. The doctrine also advocated for smaller, more specialized units capable of responding quickly to changing circumstances, units that could think on their feet, just as the human pilots had done. But it wasn't just about altering tactics. It was about a deeper, more significant shift in the way the Dominion viewed its enemies. The shift was subtle at first, but over time, it would become clear. We had learned the hard way that humans were not just a threat to be neutralized. They were a force to be reckoned with. As I prepared to submit my final report on the Vascan incident, I couldn't help but reflect on the human pilots, especially Dex Varro, the one who had orchestrated the entire engagement. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. We had come to conquer their world, and yet, in doing so, we had been forced to rethink everything we knew about warfare. The report would be filed, of course, and it would be classified in Dominion records. But more than that, it would be a turning point. The Vascan incident was no longer just an engagement. It was the moment when the Dominion learned that human beings defending their homes were a different kind of enemy. A kind of enemy that couldn't be defeated by numbers or firepower alone. The Dominion High Command's decision to revise our entire military doctrine in light of the Vascan incident marked a monumental shift. The defeat had been humbling, but it had ignited a deep introspection within the ranks. We were no longer the unchallenged superpower we had once believed ourselves to be. The enemy we faced, the humans, were resilient, adaptable, and relentless. And for the first time, the Dominion had been forced to confront that their fighting spirit could not be measured in numbers alone. It was a difficult pill to swallow. As I sat in the final debriefing, where the revised doctrine was to be announced, I could feel the weight of the moment. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, intelligence analysts, and military strategists, all of them now trying to grapple with a reality that had been so far beyond their previous understanding. Prex Dullan stood at the podium, his posture still as commanding as ever, though his eyes betrayed a deeper weariness than I had seen in him before. He had been part of the military's backbone for decades, but the fallout from Vascan Prime had rattled even him. The words he was about to speak would mark a turning point for the Dominion, one that would forever alter our approach to warfare. "Ladies and gentlemen," Prex began, his voice steady but carrying the burden of years of command, "the Vascan incident has shown us that victory is not always measured in numbers or firepower. It is not enough to simply overwhelm the enemy. We must also understand their will to fight, their drive to defend what matters most to them." I could see the officers around the room shift uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. There was an understanding now, one that we all shared. The words were heavy with truth. "We've learned something critical," Prex continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We've learned that human beings, when defending their homes, are not just soldiers, they are a force of nature. They fight with a depth of resolve that we have failed to account for, and that has cost us dearly." There was a murmur in the room, but this time it wasn't a questioning hum. It was the kind of silence that follows the acknowledgement of a hard truth. A truth that could no longer be ignored. "Therefore," Prex said, his voice growing stronger, "the Dominion's military doctrine must change. We must adapt to what we've learned. The old methods of warfare, the ones based on sheer superiority, no longer suffice. We need to approach human defenses with a new mindset, one that accounts for the resilience, creativity, and indomitable spirit that we saw on Vascan Prime." Over the following weeks, the Dominion's strategy began to take shape. The new doctrine emphasized flexibility, creativity, and an understanding of the enemy's resolve. The intelligence divisions, including my own, were tasked with not just gathering data but analyzing human behavior in ways we hadn't before. We were to study not only their technologies and tactics but also their psychology, their motivations, their drives, and the deep-seated desire to protect their homes and their families. For the first time, we were instructed to respect the human will to fight, not just in theory, but as a real, measurable factor in warfare. The concept of home was now integrated into our strategic assessments. We were to understand that any attack on a human colony, any invasion, would be met with far more than military resistance. It would be met with a passion to protect what they had built. The Dominion also began training small, specialized units, capable of thinking quickly, adapting on the fly, and responding to unpredictable combat conditions. These units would no longer rely on preset doctrines. Instead, they would be taught to improvise, to create their own strategies, and to anticipate human unpredictability. It was a stark departure from our traditional emphasis on rigid tactics and formations. I was appointed to a new role, one that focused on integrating these new insights into our intelligence assessments. I worked closely with analysts from across the Dominion, gathering reports and studying previous engagements to ensure we would never again underestimate a human defense. The lessons from Vascan Prime were etched into our collective memory, and every piece of intelligence was scrutinized under the lens of human resolve. Months passed, and while the scars of the Vascan incident never truly healed, there was a quiet sense of resolve in the Dominion. We had learned. We had adapted. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the new doctrine began to bear fruit. Our military units became more agile, more intuitive. They were able to read a battlefield with the same creativity the human pilots had displayed. We had learned to expect the unexpected. And then, finally, it happened. A new threat emerged, one that was not human, but one that required the very same approach we had learned from the Vascan engagement. A new species had entered Dominion territory, and their military strategies were unlike anything we had encountered before. But this time we were ready. We understood that our greatest strength now lay not in our numbers, not in our ships, but in our ability to adapt, to think beyond the traditional constraints of warfare. This time, when we engaged the new enemy, the Dominion's forces moved with a fluidity that hadn't been possible before. They anticipated the enemy's movements, they adapted to their tactics, and they fought not just with strength, but with creativity. The enemy was defeated, but it wasn't just a victory of firepower. It was a victory of understanding, of adapting to the battlefield, to the will of those who fought in it. As I reviewed the engagement reports, I couldn't help but think back to Dex Varro and the human pilots of Vascan Prime. They had shown us that strength wasn't just about overwhelming force. It was about understanding the purpose behind the fight. The humans hadn't just been defending a planet. They had been defending their very lives, their homes, and everything they held dear. That was a lesson we would carry with us forever. The Dominion would never again underestimate the power of home. And with that, the path forward was clear. Our military had been reshaped. Our strategy had evolved. And the Dominion was stronger, not because we had more ships or more fighters, but because we had learned to fight with the same kind of passion, the same kind of resolve, that our enemies had shown us.